Hello everyone, welcome to GGN. Today is Wednesday, November 7th, 2012. I'm Darko. My website is ggnonline.com, and on YouTube my channels are ddarko2012 and ddarko2013. All the links and stories will be posted in YouTube's video description, and I'm ready to continue here. We were just talking about Norway and Sweden and how Israel's relations, they're kind of starting to mess them up. But now I saw this article, and it says, after Ahmadinejad, the greatest threat to Israel is Erdogan of Turkey. So, pretty interesting. And they say that this is surprising because Turkey and Israel used to be close allies. The rift between the countries is directly linked to the ascendancy of Islamist rule in Turkey. It's an interesting article because I've mentioned it many times before about how Turkey is being used by the Zionists themselves to help take down Syria and possibly help create a little Kurdish state that would be supported as a Zionist Western proxy state. While at the same time, as the Sheikh Hossein puts it, the fall of Constantinople or Istanbul would take place and Turkey would withdraw from NATO. And of course, that's when Russia comes into play. And like I said, they're shooting themselves in the foot. A person that commented said that they're actually shooting themselves in the head, which I agree. A man self-immolates outside Turkish Prime Minister office in Ankara. Outside the Turkish Prime Minister's office, it says, according to media sources, the man had doused himself in gasoline before setting himself on fire. It was extinguished immediately by security staff, and the man was taken to a nearby hospital. Says this comes 2 days after an unknown gunman opened fire at the Prime Minister's office building. Again, that was a story that was not really out there in the mainstream media. And other people see this as well in the comments. It's only the beginning. The leaders of Turkey are taking the country deep and fast into multiple disasters the nation could never imagine before. And Erdogan is going to destroy Turkey for the sake of the Zionists. Turkish police fire tear gas at hunger strike supporters. This is from November 4th. I've covered this before. But they had to use tear gas and water cannon on protesters supporting a hunger strike by Kurdish prisoners. The Turkish Prime Minister branded the strikers' actions as a complete show, but doctors warned that they will start to die in the next 10 days. And remember that because there will be a similar situation with Israel and how they react to Palestinian protesters coming up. Bahrain revokes citizenship of opposition members. Remember, Bahrain just banned protests. And now they're revoking citizenship of opposition members. This is all part of the plan I was talking about strengthening and creating this Gulf Union. They need to prevent any kind of instability in that region. That's mostly Sunni-dominated. Pakistanis stage protest against recent Shia killings. In Pakistan, the Shia organizations, along with members of the civil society, staged protests to denounce the targeted killings of innocent Shias across the violence-racked country. I like reading some of these comments in Press TV. These are Saudi Wahhabi savages put in power by racist British Anglo-Saxons to spill the blood of Muslims all over the world. I've mentioned that before about how they want to basically have Muslims around the world fighting each other. Saudi House of al-Assad will very soon die the worst death than bin Laden and other Wahhabi Salafis. So, ship carrying these Muslims, Rohingyas, sinks, 100 missing. Myanmar's government refuses to recognize these Muslims as citizens and labels the minority of about 800,000 as illegal immigrants from neighboring Bangladesh. U.S.-led night raid kills 3 civilians in South Afghanistan. So at least 3 civilians have been killed and several others were injured in a night raid carried out by U.S.-led troops in the troubled southern Afghanistan area. And yeah, when they do that too, they also steal their jewelry. I've covered that before. Also, Bales, this is an update on this trial. The soldier thought he was doing the right thing in the Afghan massacre. He was surprised when he was told to drop the weapons. So he was accused of killing 16 Afghan civilians. Like I said before, I thought he was aided by somebody else. He was baffled when fellow soldiers told him to relinquish his weapons. So he said that he had been drinking whiskey and watching the revenge-themed Man on Fire with other soldiers before the massacre. The prosecutor said later Bales put on a cape and killed 16 people. Egyptians protest outside Saudi Arabia's embassy. They're actually staging a sit-in at the Saudi Arabia embassy in Cairo, Egypt, demanding the release of their loved ones from the Saudi prisons. They say my son has been detained in Riyadh for 3 years unlawfully. He's been subjected to extreme torture, and as a consequence, he's lost his eyesight and is suffering from diabetes. This isn't the first protest, but Egypt, just overall, like I've been covering yesterday, seems to be emerging, if not a puppet state, like a stronger puppet state, possibly a sovereign state, who knows, right? But they're in the news a lot now. Americans tour base to recruit Libyan anti-militant force, says commander. So this is kind of a joke, right? I was just talking about how the rebels in Syria were fighting each other and the militias in Libya were fighting each other. And of course we know the West, especially France and NATO, helped arm and back and oversee these terrorists that flooded in from all around Africa and the Mideast to help oust leader Muammar Gaddafi to get a regime change so they can go in there and do what they wanted with their country, especially their oil. But now, what do they want to do? They want to recruit Libyan anti-militant force. They plan to train to fight militants. Yeah, this is sad, though, you know, because they're talking about, tribal loyalties and stuff like that. Basically, what's going on in Bani Walid and stuff like that, they're going to take the places like Misrata, that were one of the highest per capita terrorists that Libya and Gaddafi was trying to, he actually had on lockdown, and he had the place secure at least. And then when the Western terrorists and the Western-backed powers started supporting all the terrorists and the uprisings after the Arab Spring, it created instability, and all of these people from Misrata, mostly terrorists, broke loose and stuff like that. So now this is how they're gonna do it. They're gonna create another type of force. So we'll see what type of fruit this plan bears. As rebels urge talks, West keeps pushing for Mali war. France and U.S. draw up plans for attack. Yeah, this is a different article. Islamist group Ansar Dine in North Mali says it rejects violence and ready to talk to the government. So they're ready to talk, but it says Western nations appear to be salivating at the prospect of an invasion of Mali, with officials playing up the importance of attacking the poorest half of one of the world's poorest countries to ensure the rule of the junta-backed interim regime. It says that to the extent the regime ever really had control over the northern half of Mali, it was lost earlier this year after Tuareg secessionists, armed with weapons looted from the NATO war in Libya, routed them. The Tuaregs were themselves ousted by Ansar Dine, which is calling for the creation of a theocratic state. Yeah, it says here about while France and U.S. are spinning this as an al-Qaeda safe haven. Remember I said, wherever they want to go and dominate their resources, because this place has resources, rich resources, they'll say, "Ooh, Al-Qaeda will suddenly pop up there." It says this Ansar Dine is trying to negotiate, insisting they reject terrorism and are willing to cut ties with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb. But once major NATO member nations get it in their head that war is necessary, there doesn't appear to be anything that convinces them otherwise. Remember saying they have to get the green light from Algeria. Says some of these talks that are being presented by Ansar Dine are actually gaining some currency in places like Algeria and Burkina Faso. So moving up and moving on here, we have expanded conflict in Syria promised by Romney will proceed under Obama. The most irrelevant election in U.S. history comes and goes as long-planned regime change using al-Qaeda death squads against Syria continues unabated. Aside from the superficial window dressing via an elaborate array of proxies through which U.S. cash and weapons will flow, more directly military aid, including securing a de facto no-fly zone over parts of northern Syria using U.S.-made Patriot missiles, batteries is now being discussed. That's right, missile batteries on Syria's border by Turkey. Actually, the AP had an article titled "Obama Re-Election Signals New Phase in Syria War," that Turkey and allies, including the U.S., have discussed the possibility of using Patriot missiles to protect a safe zone inside Syria. This is claimed it would only be implemented with a UN mandate. It says such a mandate is unlikely with Russia and China having obstructed all efforts to justify the Libya-style military aggression against Syria. So it says additional cross-border incidents will most likely be used as a pretext instead. That's right, Secretary Clinton handpicks client Syrian regime at meeting in despotic nation of Qatar. So yeah, they're trying to set up a new council to include the terrorist representation. Then you have the British Prime Minister unveiling a plan to arm the terrorists in Syria. There he is with Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah. It says British Prime Minister David Cameron has revealed his government's intentions to get more deeply involved with the civil war in Syria by supplying terrorists fighting the country's popular government with heavy weaponry. They've already been supporting the regime change with its spying agents and special troops, or SAS, giving logistical and communication services Of course, you have Israel with reconnaissance. So here comes the war rhetoric, right? UK Prime Minister David Cameron says safe passage for Assad could be arranged. Yeah, we could arrange it, just like Gaddafi, right? Just like all the other guys. It's clear Assad wouldn't leave power without safe passage and immunity. So he would support offering Assad a safe passage out of the country if it meant he would step down. In other words, they're getting ready to turn the heat up. It says here a Syria's defected prime minister. I don't know about all that. He said, despite telling Assad he needs to find a political solution, Bashar really thinks that he can settle this militarily. Well, you know, like I said before, they already have a date and a timeline. I think it was 2013 or 2014, one of those years, where they're going to have supposedly political reform and stuff like that. It's going to be presented to the people, but they don't want that. They don't want them to determine their own fate, their own future. They want to do it for them. So they have to do it. They have to get this regime changed before that reform can take place. Unless he retains power and quells the rebellion, he will either be killed or face trial at the International Criminal Court at The Hague. David Cameron meets Syrian refugees as the UK begins rebel talks. So they're talking about the terrorists. So see, this is just about as sick as what they did with Haiti, you know, with the whole hurricane and thing like that. I'm pretty sure that was HAARP-induced, and they created it, and they go in there like Clinton and stuff like that, and hand them bottles of water, and they wear their, you know, their little fishing vests and act as if like like they're there to help and stuff like that. Well, these same a-holes are actually funding the terrorists. They're actually talking with them, and they're actually causing these people's families to be killed and targeted, and they have to, now they're out in the winter, and it's getting harder and harder. And they created these refugees. They created this over-the-border crisis by arming the terrorists and creating this this operation for a regime change. So they created the problem, and now they're coming in and offering the solution. You know, just real douchebags. You know? But hey, they're humanitarians in the mainstream media. UN official says credible reports show Assad army used cluster bombs in Syria. Claim that Assad and the Syrian government has denied, saying they don't have any such weapons. But either way, we know that the West used them in Libya. And if they weren't using those, they were using uranium-tipped bombs in Iraq. So again, you know, hey, I guess when people don't have any attention span or memories, they can just put this BS out there and people will eat it up, right? And say, they're trying to get people on board with the UN here. So if they have to lie, they'll do it. The ends justify the means for these people, for these globalists. And so, you know, credible evidence, yeah, right, like Iraq's WMDs. Brother of Syrian parliament speaker assassinated. So this is news right here. The gunman killed the brother of Syria's parliament speaker in a hail of bullets as he drove to work in Damascus on Tuesday. So assassinations, remember this, Syrian general assassinated Damascus from October 30th. So this is CIA, and there's a lot of explosions lately, and the place isn't secured right now in Syria. That's the news on. That's pretty much the best news I can give you. It's the areas that they had secure. It's just not. There's still a lot of suicide bombers right now, and right now it's moved from the north, from Aleppo, down south near Golan Heights, and I think that is part of the point. Bring it to Israel's doorstep right before the elections. Like I said, check out the Land Destroyer report on the Brookings Institute for Regime Change in Syria. It's a report, it's a report that's written. It's not anything that's chosen democratically, by your leaders and stuff like that. It's roundtables and closed doors. Very rich men. And this is what they're supporting. Our men, these terrorists that Cameron is talking to, actually blew up an evangelical church in Syria's Aleppo. That's right. They have Christians on the run, and they're targeting them, and other types of Muslims. Divide and conquer. That's what I was saying. So, next up, 6 civilians killed by armed militias in northern Syria. The armed militias fired 11 mortar shells in an anti-militia protest. And they refer to the word as militia, which is, I think, is Shabia. And actually, it's a code word. It's a buzzword that the terrorists use to say that they're pro-Syrian regime militia. They're actually the terrorists themselves. So, and they'll be like, oh, but they're actually killing regular civilians. And just like Turkey, like I talked about, the false flag at the Turkish border, mortar shells. That's what the terrorists use. UN condemns Syrian military incursion into demilitarized zone. So, yeah. That's right. Syrian tanks entered the buffer zone and endangers regional stability. So poor little Israel. Oh, don't worry about the Palestinians and the settlements. people's houses getting demolished. The United Nations is more concerned about some tanks rolling over their effing border. This is GGN. Thank you.